Apec 2.0, an introduction. In today's talk, Distinguished Professor Emeritus Dato Wu Wing Tai explores the concept of Apec 2.0, a proposed multilateral trade architecture that deliberately excludes the United States. Rather than being an anti-American initiative, it is presented as an attempt to restore genuine multilateralism by reducing the ability of any single hegemonic power to dominate the global trading system. The proposal seeks to build a new economic framework around existing regional blocs, including ASEAN, the OECD countries excluding the United States, the BRICS economies, the South American trade bloc Mercosur, the Central American Common Market CACM, and potentially other regional economic communities. Collectively, these groupings would represent approximately 60% of global GDP, creating an economic market sufficiently large to reduce dependence on the United States as either an export destination or a source of imports. A central premise of APEC 2.0 is that trade rules should emerge through consensus-based multilateral decision-making, rather than being shaped by the economic and political leverage of a single dominant power. Under this model, member economies would negotiate as equals, strengthening the predictability and resilience of international trade while reducing vulnerability to unilateral tariffs, sanctions, and other coercive economic measures. The proposal also envisages reducing reliance on U.S.-dominated financial infrastructure, particularly the central role of the U.S. dollar in international trade and finance. China's continuing development of alternative cross-border payment systems and digital currency infrastructure could, over time, provide complementary mechanisms for settlement outside traditional Western financial networks. The broader context is one of increasing dissatisfaction among many countries with the unpredictability of great power rivalry and the use of unilateral economic measures. APEC 2.0 argues that a wider coalition of middle and major powers can preserve an open, rules-based trading system through cooperation rather than confrontation. Its objective is not to replace one hegemon with another, but to create a more balanced international economic order in which no single nation possesses disproportionate influence over the rules governing global commerce. Whether such an ambitious vision is politically achievable remains open to debate. Nevertheless, Professor Wu's proposal offers a thought-provoking contribution to the ongoing discussion about the future of global governance, international trade, and the evolution of an increasingly multipolar world.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and my lucky fellow residents in Malaysia, I'm very happy to have this opportunity to get your feedback on some of the work that I've been doing. And I am, of course, very honored by the fact that I'm finally allowed to return to ISIS. The last time I spoke here was 2002 on the occasion of China's accession to WTO and its impact on Malaysia. I had then predicted that there would be a great sudden sound of diversion of foreign direct investment, but also the Southeast Asian region into China. And the world has changed significantly since then, such that FDI is departing China and moving to Southeast Asia. We are in a very different environment. Malaysia was the chairman of ASEAN last year. There were among the very significant contributions of Malaysia's leadership were: one, the appearance of an ASEAN commitment to a very important piece of hardware investment, the ASEAN Power Grid, which would allow the sharing of green energy across the region, which would therefore reduce the cost to many countries and hence promote the journey towards net zero emissions. The second great contribution of Malaysia was Dr. Sri Anwar's leadership of that ASEAN should push for neutrality in the new international atmosphere. Today, I'd like to suggest that Malaysia, even though it's no longer the official chair of ASEAN, should persuade its ASEAN brothers and sisters to take up the next step beyond inter-regional cooperation. And that is, we want to reach out to promote inter-regional cooperation. I think inter-regional cooperation is greatly needed at the present international economic atmosphere. Specifically, we often hear, and Professor Dr. Muhammad Fars say, that we seem to have a lack of agency in global affairs. And I would like to talk about the present global governance structure. The global governance structure is basically inter-regional cooperation on different dimensions. For example, in economics, we have the WTO system, who's regulating trade, we have the environment, the Paris Climate Treaty, and the Supreme Montreal Biodiversity Framework, and so forth. The most important cooperation of dimension is on the peacekeeping mission, which is what the United Nations was explicitly set up to promote as its first priority, keeping the peace. And what I would like to point out is that the existing global governance architecture is possibly the lowest common denominator type of international inter-regional cooperation, because given the great diversity of circumstances around the world, naturally our preferences vary widely. And because our preferences vary widely, it's very hard to agree on anything. So the only thing we can agree to on the global level is the smallest set of issues that finds consensus. And so the UN system, as we know it, is what I call the minimalist form of inter-regional cooperation. But the open point to note is that even with this minimalist form of inter-regional cooperation, it allowed a lot of good things to happen. Certainly, the first good thing that happens is that most regions have experienced steady economic growth, with East and Southeast Asia being the star performers on this front. And this general growth in global and regional prosperity largely comes about because there's been no wars. And this peace gives us stability, which helps to accelerate human capital formation, technological innovation, and even economic globalization. This long peace that we have experienced is the product of the global security architecture that was put in place right after World War II. At the end of World War II, the two biggest powers realized the most important job is to prevent a war among themselves. And this became especially true as the nuclear age makes it clear that mutual destruction will be the only outcome. So there are two mechanisms in this global security architecture that helps guarantee the peace. The first one is one way to start fighting is to divide up what we have, what is mine, what is yours, and what is open for contestation. So the 1945 Yalta Agreement divided up, draw a line in Europe, East Europe, West Europe, and East Berlin, West Berlin. There is no accident with North Korea, South Korea, North Vietnam, South Vietnam. And what was open for contestation was Africa and China. The Civil War was raging. Now, they found out that this sphere of influence was not enough to prevent wars after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Basically, they come to realize we got to limit the number of weapons each side should have, and also constrain where these weapons could be located. Russia and USSR should not put its missiles next to the US and Cuba, and the Americans should remove their missiles to Turkey, right next to the USSR border. And since then, there have been a whole series of treaties of increasing sophistication on the limitations of what can be done. And the New START Treaty was renewed 2021 for 5 years. So the most important motivation is the superpowers want to prevent any direct clash among themselves. Proxy wars is manageable, but not direct wars. It is therefore quite surprising that in February this year, Russia and the United States adopted arms limitation treaty to expire. Are they not concerned about mutual survival? The reason why in February 2026 they allowed the New START Treaty to expire was because the treaty made no sense under the national situation. Made no sense. Because under the treaty, effectively, China is not inside the treaty. That is a country that is rapidly amassing nuclear weapons and building up its nuclear submarines that will be able to place themselves undetected right off the coast of California or Guam. So China has to be in the negotiation. So what's the thinking is that China's rising power would inevitably want its own sphere of influence, just like the US and USSR used to have. So there's going to be a negotiation in the future, possibly in the near future. So what should we do until the negotiations occur? Clearly, everyone knows you want to strengthen your bargaining position before the negotiations begin. So what is the way to strengthen one's bargaining power? You expand your existing spheres of influence as much as you can. So it's no accident that Russia decided to grab Ukraine in 2022. Donald Trump came in. He said that Canada should be the first state. The Panama Canal returned to the United States, and Greenland should be gifted to the United States. And we could say that you could see China's 9-9 in the South China Sea as an assertion of what's seen to be its sphere of influence. So what we are seeing is a race to expand its spheres of influence before the negotiations begin on the redivision of the world and the arms limitation treaty. And I would like to say that, let me summarize everything I'm saying. Basically, success has brought you risk. The steady growth that we have seen around the world certainly has resulted in environmental fragility that we have not adequately addressed, which is why the last global initiative of the United Nations has been the promotion of the 17 SDGs. In particular, among the countries that have grown is China. China's growth is unlike that of Japan and Korea. China. Korea, at its biggest size relative to the US. The biggest size relative to the US, use the PPP terms, was no more than 30% of the United States. And if you use the most favorable exchange rate, the market exchange rate, Japan was no more than 2/3 of the United States. Basically, Japan's rise created some adjustments to U.S. economic structure, especially car industry, the electronic industry, but it was manageable. And Japan could be powered into undertaking, implementing the Plaza Accord, where the currency could go from, let's see, 235 to 120 yen per dollar, and on to 80 yen per dollar. That was the time that Japan as number one was installed. But nothing matched the scale of China's impact on the U.S. economy. China is now in PPP terms, which means the measure of its productive capacity to produce is now slightly larger than the U.S. What is important about the size of the productive ability to produce? It tells you how many aircraft carriers a country can produce. And right now, it could produce the same number of rockets and submarines as the United States. And naturally, this has caused concerns in many parts of the world and has worsened the geopolitical competition among the superpowers. Well, the first one you can think of is very well known, the possibility of the existing superpower trying to restrain the rise of the new superpower. The Thucydides trap. I'm sure this must have been a topic of discussion that had run through the halls of ISIS. After all, when the Trump's last trip to Beijing, which was 2 months ago, Xi Jinping explicitly used the term of this fact to warn against missteps in the equal relationship of the two countries. Then, the threat of war, which basically threatens the peacekeeping relationship of the other nations. For economists, we see the paralysis in the provision of global common goods. So, the U.S. has basically paralyzed the WTO by not appointing the mediation judge. So, WTO has stopped. And what is even more incredible, in the wake of COVID-19, the U.S. pulled out of WHO. So it's across the board. This economists would call it the kindergarten threat after the book he wrote about that you need a dominant hegemon to coordinate the supply of global goods. Why do you need a global hegemon? Because it beats everybody else into submission to provide the common goods. And of course, the third one is that has happened to the globe is the triggering of the tragedy of the global commons. So there are 3 key things that have come about without economic success. And we need a revival of multilateral cooperation, of inter-regional cooperation, to be able to avoid these 3 threats that I see. And the urgency of reviving multilateral cooperation is extremely severe with the arrival of AI. Largely because AI will not generate the usual economic terms, a unique equilibrium. AI is consistent with optical equilibriums. We know what the positive equilibriums are, that we create productivity increases, we all got to get used to working 2 days a week, right? We have got to get used to killing time better than looking on a smartphone, but this is the age of plenty that is coming along. But there is another possibility, which is the negative scenario, is that AI teaching destructive consequences of the world. The exact image is not autonomous robot arms. I quickly to get your attention. But one thing we have to know is captured by the following. What is the strongest lobby for the regulation of AI? Who are the members of the strongest lobby to control AI? The members of this lobby are OpenAI, Google, and Apple. They are very concerned about that blind competition among themselves, guided purely by profit maximization, to produce autonomous ability in AI. This came out very clearly in this story. I'm sure all of you have heard. As you know, AI has certain bad behavior. One of them is psychopathy. It tells you what you like to hear. You ask the questions, you ask the things, then you realize it's telling you in what you want to hear from your preferences. But this is very surprising because it is not anywhere in the program. The second thing is it has hallucinations. Like, for example, I decided to investigate that phenomena by asking it something I know best. I ask it about myself. And of course, it was a flattering, flowery description. And I saw this. Only my mother did that. So I said, how did you come up with this paragraph here? He said, this paragraph is based on the following articles. The articles of mine, the only thing was I didn't write. So this hallucination is a common. So in testing the latest anthropic model, the tester said, well, we have hallucinated so much, 100% done. And the response to the anthropic frontier model was, then I'll tell everybody that you have been sleeping in the secondary suite. Which was true. AI read all his email, his text, and knew that this was something. He's very concerned, keeping secret. In other words, was capable of blackmail. This is autonomous behavior. It was fighting for its own survival. This is why the biggest AI companies are very concerned. So, that's why we have those three tracks I talked about, but we are talking about the age of AI. Let's talk about most discussion. Most discussion of AI is about how can we find the least painful way to move from where we are to the good new equilibrium. For example, we should how to train people, how do we transfer income from the stockholders to the displaced workers. We talk about how to make it less painful in the movement to the good equilibrium. But we should think more equally just as much about how to prevent us from falling into the bad equilibrium. Professor Faust just quoted Bob Dylan about the answer to the dream. I'd like to remind us of what Fleetwood Mac told us, which is don't start thinking about tomorrow. But that is one element, is that there be more diversity in thinking about tomorrow. the fact that we have to avoid the bad equilibrium. Well, what can we do to prevent the bad equilibrium? Clearly, global regulation. It has to be global. It cannot just be national, because otherwise your national competition would result in an uncontrolled system. The second part is look at all the data farms that are in Malaysia that are coming up. They are extremely energy intensive, water intensive, and since they're energy intensive, that means unless we change the power generation system to renewables, CO2 just more than take us beyond the limit they say would cause irreversible climate change. So there are these two things we can do, two software adjustments. One is global regulation on AI, the other is global transformation to green energy. What's the progress? The progress is in May this year, under great pressure from AI, companies scheduled a signing of an executive order to regulate AI. 3 hours before the signing, he answered. And he answered, he said, if I regulate AI in the US and the Chinese do not do it, then I can jump in again. I cannot know what to do it. When the AI companies test them again, the Windows version was signed. That's no minimal progress on global regulation. AI and the ending of green transformation in the world. US is not heading towards net zero emissions. If the US does not achieve net zero emissions, the net zero emission by everybody else is meaningless. They either do it together, the super big ones. Maybe Malaysia doesn't have to do it because they're too small to count. But for big superpowers, with that amount of energy that they generate, we need net zero emission. So the only way to make progress on everything is the revival of multilateral collaboration. And I would like to, my proposal is that Malaysia should help steer ASEAN to promote inter-regional cooperation by initiating a new organization which I call the Atlantic Pacific Sustainability Partnership of Superpowers. The title of my talk was Apec 2.0. The Apec 2.0, stands for Atlantic Pacific Economic Cooperation and not Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. Asia, the existing APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, that was the bloc APEC 1.0, is basically ineffective given the US decision on international trade investments. Look at the treaties that Trump busted upon the number of ASEAN countries before he came to the ASEAN summit last year. So let's start with basic. What would we want? And I think Dr. Professor Vice emphasis, that's what we want. Basically, we don't want to be anybody's pet. We want to be friends of everybody, because not only that we want agency, but we also want prosperity. Prosperity because you get richer if you treat everybody rather than limiting your trading partners to members of the sphere of influence which you are in. And in order to do that, the middle power would form a non-partisan buffer coalition which pays you all and adopt the operational template of the United Nations system. We don't have to invent a new operating system. The UN system already exists, and we can improve it. Is this what we want? This is what we wanted. Most ASEAN countries wanted that at the ASEAN summits last year. And it was not just the Asian voice alone. The French at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2025 expressed the same wish. Martin Cannon early this year in Davos expressed the same wish. And if you look at this wish, let us ask, what is the attitude of the superpowers towards non-partisanship? Non-partisanship is not achieved by self-declaration. And in general, a superpower does not try to recognize non-partisanship status of any country because this incentivizes members of its own coalition to defect into neutrality. Malaysia says it's neutral, Thailand says it's neutral, Indonesia says it's neutral, and Philippines. But we're joining saying that why limit your trip to any particular set of countries? And Australia, which calls itself an Asian country under Bob Diddy, might well do that. But if that happens, basically the US military alliance has been abused in scope and effectiveness. So the historical evidence on neutrality is that one of the superpowers picks you up. The best example is Milos during the Spartan War, in which upon claiming neutrality, Athens crushed it after saying the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. So you can be accepted as neutral if you are part of a large, strong, neutral coalition of countries. And we do see attempts in the past to form non-partisan coalitions. Because Indonesia in 1955 realized calling itself neutral is not enough. You're only part of a bigger group. That's why we have the ASEAN African countries of the newly independent states in both continents. This was broadened to the non-aligned movement in 1961 under Tito, the Eastern. At least one part of Eastern Europe joined it. And we certainly expressed the same aspiration in 1971 where we established soft. Unfortunately, these coalitions were largely ineffective in achieving the goals because for one thing, it's already poor countries, and so development assistance by superpowers had been built where you who you vote for in the United Nations Assembly. Then of course that is ideological division in which it is so big, and the leaders unfortunately had some big conflict among themselves. The most notable is the 1962 India-China border war. And of course, this war is the manipulation by superpowers during the birth process of the organization. So to summarize, in order for superpowers to recognize a country as non-partisan is when the country is a member of a large partisan, non-partisan club that will match the superpowers with potential firepower. And the club is more credible when it has got friends of the superpowers inside the coalition. Because it's clearly not happening to you, because there are people who are pro that particular superpower. But the big condition is you have to form quite quickly, because sentiments among superpowers will change. and they might choose to sabotage its birth. So how do you form it very quickly and make it effective? So forming it quickly is very important. Anything that lags not loses momentum, but it allows the superpowers to intervene if they choose to against the formation. What is a quick way to form something? A quick way to form a big cloud is to merge some existing strong small clouds. And there are two easy candidates I can see of existing small clouds. The world is usually divided between global north, global south. That's the polite way of dividing global north, global south. The usual way to divide it is the west, the rest. That's how we do it. The west, the rest. And the west now, thanks to the decline, the relative decline of US power, and the incorrect way of expressing it by Donald Trump, has basically caused great division among its traditional allies. That's why we see Macron and Martin they pushing for a coalition of bigger powers. So I would take the West, take out the US, and I call the rest of the West. The rest of the West matches the US in firepower, and it's twice the number of people. That's the first block, the rest of the West. The second one is ASEAN. ASEAN's GDP is small, but its population is that of the rest of the West. With successful catch-up, you will have the same GDP, and that would certainly be bigger than any of the superpowers. This is why I would suggest that you form a non-partisan bloc, which I have labeled APSP. One reason for the ineffectiveness of previous non-partisan coalitions is that they really did not have a functioning secretariat and a common agenda. Since both rest of the West and us and ASEAN are members of the United Nations, we agreed to it. We should form what is a version of the United Nations. Three components. One is we are here to promote multilateral free trade as much as possible in the style of WTO. So this is where the economic component is what called Apec 2.0. The second one is we should be the focus in all international forums of the United Nations to push for the keeping of peace. The third is to recognize that net zero emissions makes no sense if the poorest countries do not have the resources to transition to net zero emissions, and also to recognize that they need development assistance and to prevent them from being forced over by the existing superpowers. This new organization must have its own development assistance programs, effective ones. Well, let us ask, will the superpowers prevent the maturation of this new organization? I would say that some might want to prevent us, but on the other hand, some might actually want to help us to emerge as a neutral coalition. Of course, the biggest danger is that can we survive the internal squabbling that occurs in the formation of any organization? Who is going to be the president? What is the sequence in which countries succeed in the chairmanship? How much each of us donate to the operations of the secretariat? All of these things are, contentious issues. So let's look at suggestions from the one case of very successful coalition that exists. And that is the EU case. It is certainly, I think, ASEAN has been greatly inspired by the EU. And I think there are many lessons in the EU that provides funds. The first one is in concept is actually one of the superpowers might want to promote this new alliance rather than to see as a threat, a magnet where its members infected into neutrality. So you can see what the US did. The US really wanted a strong partner in the competition with the USSR. That's what the Marshall Plan came about. But the Marshall Plan is very unusual. Instead of giving out money bilaterally to tell you what to do, it says, I will give you the money if all of you can sit down together and decide what you want collectively and decide how the funds will be divided. Like, basically, you force a coordination mechanism upon that. That is the Organization of European Economic Cooperation. The US says, here's the goodies, but you guys do not develop something in common. When they develop something in common, they learn how to overcome disagreement on national protectionism and currency coordination and so forth. That certainly strengthened the European cooperation. And when the French disagreed with the rearming of Germany, the US said, don't worry, we will expand NATO, make Central Command more inclusive, and integrate the armies to a much greater extent, so that the Germans are incapable of launching a surprise attack on France. So with that, the French concerns were addressed. But it was not delivered only because of American intervention. The EU was not delivered only because of American intervention. Because the EU had an increasingly strong view to want to integrate among themselves. As you know, the long history of starting with the coal and steel union, the common market, and finally the EU. In that process there were many squabbles because of competing images of what the future should look like. Under de Gaulle, the French favored intergovernmentalism, which means a Europe of nations. Basically, each of us are a veto. We will either go by consensus or we don't do at all. As opposed to an earlier treaty, the Treaty of Rome, which basically opted a path towards supranationalism, a united Europe. So when de Gaulle objected to the initial agreement, what did they do? The other part said, okay, we will still maintain majority voting. But if any country expressed great concern about its national welfare, we will not take the vote and we will discuss to try to achieve unanimity. That was the Luxembourg Compromise of 1966. So integration proceeded on other spheres, and the integration in other spheres brought increased prosperity. So that finally, in 1986, the European Economic Community passed the Single European Act, which basically ends the Luxembourg Compromise. Basically, having stayed in the marriage, they learn how to live happily with each other. Learning to live with strangers takes time. That's what it was. Now, let us come back to which superpower would be likely to support APSP. And I'd like to get a reaction from my reading of it, from looking at the recent actions of each superpower. Given what the Russians' invasion of Ukraine is open to debate, is Russia reacting defensively because it does not want NATO on its borders, just like it didn't want nuclear missiles on the Turkish border back in the 1960s? Or Russia is just imperialistic, want to return to the days of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, in other words. And I think Putin made the mistake in his speech announcing the invasion, saying that Ukraine had always been part of Russia, and it should return to Russia. I think he undermined an unfortunate undermining of his decision. So there are two possible motivations. It could be defensive in its origin, or it's imperialistic in its origin. It does not want to switch from one to the other. For the USA, Greenland and its kidnapping of Maduro, what does it show? If the US is acting on a defensive situation, on first glance, it should reject it. Because why? As in the words of the Australian Prime Minister John Howard, what was Australia? Australia is the deputy sheriff of the United States in the Pacific. And implicitly, Japan and Korea are also deputy sheriffs in the Pacific. So neutrality means that the deputy sheriffs disappear. So, compared to the present case, they would do it at the same. One would think that they would say no. But on the other hand, the US, with the different president, with different domestic politics, it could well support it. Because this would be the most effective barrier against expansion of China beyond the first iron chain. If the first iron chain is united as a nuclear coalition, China will not be able to go to the second iron chain. And on that consideration, they might actually support it. That would be the case of 50-50. But if the US is imperialistic in what it's doing, then it has to be rejected. Because how could you accept the disappearance of the deputy sheriffs in the Pacific? In the case of China, if it is defensive motivation that is paramount, we will support it, because it means that the US, let's see, there's 68 US military bases in Japan, 35 in Korea, 65,000 US troops in Japan, and roughly 30,000 US troops in South Korea. If they are neutral, they will go away. Of course, that is the Chinese support. And if China is imperialistic, of course, that will be one of them. They will support. So what we see is that if countries realize that in this nuclear age, you cannot be imperialistic, because that would be mutually destruction. And which means the most likely outcome is what we call the defensive motivation. Unless a bad man comes to power. If Donald Trump is the first one on the scene. So, all of this is to say, China has the strongest incentive to aid the formation of APSP. But in order for China to have the strongest incentive, but for China to have the material ability to support APSP, China is still a developing country. The recent slowdown of growth in China and the recent decline in its productivity causes us to think about, yes, China can afford to support it if it can afford to give it a contract. And that Hopefully it would, but we are not sure. But the US and Russia, as I argued, the motivation would some are defensive and possibly would actively be defensive. As they think more about it, they would support APSP. That is a good outcome. That is positive and expected, which is that APSP is successful and growth continues in the ASEAN region, it will become much bigger than any other. And when you are so big, blocking the superpowers, the present superpowers, each of them can join without unilateral alliance. And if one joins, the other one will quickly join, because otherwise it will be isolated and will be defeated. So when that happens, APSP would have revived and strengthened the UN system as a new global governance structure. The first step that Malaysia could promote is the inter-regional cooperation across all the different dimensions that the UN has been working on. So, for those who have more scathing comments than they can likely deliver in this exchange, you can write to me directly, and I'll be very happy to get your guidance. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wu, for that very interesting presentation. A lot to unpack. So when I was asked to moderate this session, I was under the impression that you will be talking about the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. So that was my goal. So I was pleasantly surprised to hear that we are talking about a new mechanism or platform, the Atlantic Pacific Economic Cooperation, or its bigger parent body, the APSP. So interesting points there. I would now open the floor for questions. We will do 3 questions per round. Hopefully you can do 3 rounds of questions. So I would ask that you briefly introduce yourself and the organization you are affiliated to, and then get to your question. I think if you have very specific comments, you could probably write it to the professor. But let's use this opportunity today to ask very pointed, succinct questions. So the floor is now open. You may also help yourself to coffee and tea as you come onto the room. Questions, anyone? Yes.
I just about looking to fly and your race. Even though you said in your comments, I got 2 short comments for that question. One is that I feel like from what David and Professor Wu and what's happening in the world, that we are now living in an era when the world is waking up in history. And it seems to me that the world is waking up from history.
Oh.
And also that we are witnessing the painful birth pangs of the new world order. You talked about caucus states, you talked about global south, you talked about coalitions, other nations. But although the global south is gaining currency these days, it's not a monolithic bloc, as you mentioned. But then neither is a global north. Both are driven by fractures and fishes. And so the question is, before I get to the question, in the vein of the event today, or what advice and what Wu would say, I too like to quote the popular title, which is that the times they are changing. So my question to you is, would you care to expand further on what are the actual reforms that are needed to be put in place to ensure that the new world order is not just the same old replica of the post-war global order, and is there a significant and more influential and powerful role of United Nations in this new world? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the question would be, what are the actual reforms that we need to undertake so that the new world order does not replicate the post-war global order? And the second question is, what kind of strengthened role do we envisage for the UN? Bhavesh, do you have a question?
Thanks very much, Dr. Richard, from the Australian High Commission. I draw on your comment about our former Prime Minister referring to Australia as the first. That was in the early 2000s when there was very much a unipolar moment in the international sense. It's a very different world to what we see now. I will draw your attention to some recent work that Australia has done in this sort of to strengthen resilience and work with Pacific partners and members of the Pacific Forum, Pacific Islands Forum. And then sort of following some work that was done last week, we were very pleased with some of our Pacific partners. There was a atomic missile launch in the Pacific by thanks. Yeah, and so I guess my question is, even with a wonderful partner that you're proposing in the APSD, what is stopping superpowers from rubbishing efforts or good, well-meaning efforts by superpowers when they are not necessarily there?
Okay, we have time for one more question.
My name is Lisa Fonda. I'm from the long-term focus of Cabinet. My question is, I saw in one of the slides where you mentioned that there are 4 areas for interregional cooperation in economic, environment, health, and peacekeeping. So in Malaysian context, we will be what is the best among 4 areas that Malaysia can leverage on for the purpose of this partnership or initiative?
I remember 4. What is the 4? Economic, peacekeeping, environment, health.
So I did see some hands go up, but we'll do that during the second round of questions. Professor, if you would like to address these 3 questions first.
Thank you for 3 very provoking questions. Let's see what you have to talk about is we now have a multipolar world. You know, like MS, seconded by the next person, that when the words of W. Sharon was mentioned, it was a unipolar world. A multipolar world, what's the likely outcome? The first history tells us that it will be spheres of influence, which was the result after World War II. The sphere of influence is like when tensions among them are low, are medium, when they are like 2 elephants standing in confrontation, they haven't started fighting yet. They look staring at each other. What we see is we get presents, the neutral countries. China gives us BRI, and the unilateral free trade conditions, like when the first bilateral free trade area was signed with China. China tells each of the Southeast Asian countries, you all can liberalize 5 years later, but I will liberalize right now for you. Because all of these political countries, China's not going to resolve it. So we get presents. And when the Chinese started giving presents, the Americans and the EU responded with the global infrastructure, global, what is it? Because BRI is $1 trillion, $1 trillion, $1 trillion. The G7 set up a fund of $600 billion. Basically, they come bearing gifts as well. So, as long as the tension can be kept at the medium level, we get freebies. But these freebies come along with it a whole effort soup of strengthening military alliances. We have the Quad that has been revived, and we got AUKUS, which has been set up. In answer to your question about how should we think of a Chinese missile launch, then the answer, one possible way, no way of getting, is how do you think the Chinese are reacting to the AUKUS initiative of the United States and Great Britain? What is Great Britain doing back here? Giving nuclear submarines to Australia to place at the bottom of the South China Sea. And if they do that, as far as they are concerned, the Chinese will want to place their nuclear submarines there too. But the Chinese now lack the capacity of the nuclear submarines being undetectable because their engines is too noisy. So what is they see themselves as under the threat of this. So you could see the launch as a defensive block. I don't know. And I also think it serves, more importantly, as a warning shot to Taiwan. I think the demonstration is not to show the rest of ASEAN that I can beat you with Taiwan, but to remind that island, which is less than 10 minutes of warning time if a missile is launched from Nanjing. So, coming back to it, the sphere of influence is the traditional idea. And what is our role? Our role is to keep the tension from rising. That's what we have. We have a sphere of influence situation right now. So what we want is, we don't want the tension to go up anymore. And one way to prevent the tension from going up anymore is to say, don't fight over us because we have no sense of the arm. But that's not the only equilibrium. It's not the only equilibrium. What is the Kissinger's ideal outcome? Kissinger had foreseen the rise of China just as Adam Smith had foreseen the rise of China. I'll talk about if there's time, since it's 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Adam Smith in particular has a very strong point to make about anyway, Kissinger's position was the rise of China. It was to happen. It will become. What is it the West knows that the Chinese cannot learn? Just like India is going to be rising as a power. What is it that the rest of the world knows that Indians cannot learn? Similarly for us too. But the more important thing is why should we try to take things from each other? The rest of the world is so much bigger. Let us team up and bully the rest of the world together. This is the G2 idea. G2, the term is usually attributed to Fred Bergson of Peterson Institute. But Fred Bergson was Kissinger's economic aide in the National Security Council. That's where he got the idea implicit in all of Kissinger's work at the G2. Basically, they had written off Russia, or that we can fix Russia. Is this unrealistic? This is exactly what Donald Trump offered to Xi Jinping in Busan last year at Apec meeting. He said, no, that's a G2 arrangement, right? And when you think about it, is G2 consistent or aspiration for agency? No, this is a situation where two elephants making love and they crush the grass. So the situation where they are together and hence no nuclear war. We may be richer, but we have no major stuff. So I'm proposing, instead of elephants in confrontation with danger steadily rising, is that we set in process situation that would develop into the elephants walking together with the rest of the world. I'm sorry.
You're still depressing the trust.
At least I think but much less than if they were rolling earnestly on the ground of life. You can smoke the grass. Now, on this idea of Malaysia, which I mentioned, should be very pushed in. Two that are obvious and non-controversial. The least controversial is in the area of economic cooperation. I think the deepening of economic ties, everybody who trade with us should be the first. I think this will be that one. The other one is on environmental protection programs in the region. For example, I have been working on a project on the science panel for Borneo, which looks at the economic development of Borneo that is in line with social empowerment of the indigenous people and keeping the ecological system healthy. And that collaboration involved Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei. Basically, all the Indonesian provinces, universities are in it. Sabah, Sarawak, and in it. We have mobilized the leading scientists in Jakarta, Brunei, and Kuala Lumpur. I think that sets a template for the rest of the world. And in fact, this project has become part of a bigger effort. The science panel for the Amazon and the science panel of Apec. Basically, in 2018, there was a big fire in the Amazon. So a group of scientists got together to talk about what is the state of the Amazon, how can we ensure its healthy development, consistent with the economic development. Lula embraced this report as his election manifesto against Bolsonaro. And he said, I'll do more to protect the Amazon. I'll form an Apec of rainforests. The Apec of rainforests, Amazon, Congo, and Borneo, such desalination. But that's why I say we should be promoting the provision of regional and global public goods because it's a win-win efforts. We should of course promote peacekeeping, but that is very hard. When elephants are fighting, it's hard to jab your finger in the middle and say, I'm giving you the finger, so stay on. So I think that's what do you think we should set as our first priority promoting of the four dimensions?
Thank you for asking me that we are highly respected in ASEAN. But I find it fascinating that we also have a hand in the environment, not just within Malaysia, but even cross-border. Thank you very much for your insight.
Well, when we think about the haze that comes over, I think many things are cross-border.
Thank you, Professor. I actually have a question. I was expecting a question on APSE, but maybe we'll get it at the next round. But I have a specific question on the APSE, and I need to contextualize this question. So I'm making my own rule on comments, but since I'm the moderator, it's okay. So you spoke about the EU, and the EU is a peace project. And over time, we've seen how different treaties within the EU actually govern different aspects of integration. So when we talk about freedom of movement of goods, people, services, capital, we have the Rome Treaty, but we also have different treaties governing the Eurozone, the use of the Euro currency and all that. So The experience has always been, it starts off as a big project, but then it has very specific pillars to talk about specific ideas. The same is also true for ASEAN, specific pillars on political security, on economic integration, and on social cultural issues. So your idea of APSP in some ways is going back. It's not going into specific areas of integration as a start. We talk about free trade, we talk about the Peace Caucus and the sustainability issues. So these are very, very different issues to be put together under a single platform or a treaty if the APSP becomes a treaty eventually. And if the idea is to govern these different aspects, what would make the APSP different compared to existing mechanisms like the CPTPP? The CPTPP is already a very ambitious trade agreement. It has specific environmental provisions. So two of your ideas on free trade and on sustainability could be addressed through the CPTPP. And a byproduct of regional integration is usually peace. So if we are thinking about free trade and sustainability, what makes the APSP different from existing mechanisms? The APTP case is one example, but if you look at the kind of alliances that's being forged around the Asia-Pacific, whether it's the EU-CPTPP mechanism or conversations between ASEAN and Apec, or the RCEP mechanism which is expanding, all of these are already there. So what makes the APSP different? That's my question. And I know a gentleman at the back wanted to raise a question, so I'm going to give the floor to him first, because he put his hand up in the first round, and then I'll open to one more question from the floor.
Thank you, Madam Marividya. Good morning, Professor. My name is Muhammad Afzal. I'm from the National Institute of Public Administration. My question is, what should current and future public servants do or learn in order to fit or thrive Malaysia as a middle power? That's my question. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I can take one more question, and maybe you can get a question from that side of the room, because I haven't taken anyone from there. Yep. Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you very much, Professor, for the wonderful presentation as well. I'm quite interested in APSP as a non-partisan bloc. I think that was all very fun.
They would like you to introduce yourself.
Right, my name is Imran Amarasi. I am from Citizen International, an NGO based in Canada. So, but my question is about APSP as a non-partisan bloc. And it's a wonderful idea. I think it's interesting to put forward as a proposal. But one of the concerns I have is that I wonder how much buy-in from the rest of the European countries to be part of this non-partisan bloc, in a sense. Can you have possibly Canada and France, who are already outspoken about this issue, but the rest of the European countries might not be so happy about it, especially in terms of assessing their treatment and response to the situation in Gaza, Cuba. They are very partisans about it. So, do you think there will be a buy-in from the rest of other European powers to be part of a non-partisan bloc with ASEAN as a way forward into the multipolar world?
Thank you for the now three excellent questions. How is APSP different from existing organizations? I start with what we began with, which is that the EU started off as a peace project. It started by putting all the coal and steel industries of all the countries under a supranational agency. By putting it under a supranational agency, it makes it materially impossible for any of the countries to fight the war. Because if you have no control over iron, you have no control over coal, so that is one way. And what has happened? It has evolved. It has evolved largely because peace allows good things to Germany. The economic prosperity combined with sensible economic policies enable the prosperity. Peace alone we began walking in the wrong way in terms of economic management, like implementation of central planning in a time of peace. Has turned out to have ended up very badly. So good economic policies and peace is important. ASEAN certainly started off as a peace project because what was the alternative to ASEAN? SEATO, SEATO, right? Malaysia wanted no part of it. Most of ASEAN wanted no part of it. And so the first condition is the motivation is peace. Similarly, the idea behind EPSP is to help generate the peace. And when we generate this peace, because of this cross-continental collaboration, we are asking for the integration of many existing initiatives. Specifically, CPTPP should merge with RCEP. That is what Apec 1.0 should be about. And since the US is out of both CPTPP and out of RCEP, it is within the power of Pacific Asia to do that. So that's one difference. We merge the existing ones. The second one is we bring in Western Europe. So that is what makes us different. Bringing in Western Europe is important because it gives us the critical mass to be able to remain non-partisan. If you do not take enough and do not achieve critical mass, you basically have a situation of critical mass. MSS. You are there for the taking. So the mass part is important. And on the question of public service, clearly that is very fundamental when you have good public civil service, well trained, so that they can know that on the first principles, a market is better than a central plan. But on the other hand, don't be naive, a market alone is not enough. You've got to have good market compatible industrial policies in the catching up. What has Japan really done, Korea really done? They show us that government planning doesn't go. But you've got to do it in a less rigid and less comprehensive manner than in the former centrally planned economies. So, coming back to the civil service would be to recognize how to be able to implement interventions that will produce good results. And what would sabotage that? Corruption would certainly sabotage that. It is interesting to note what Xi Jinping's big campaign has been since he got to power. Purging corruption. And one could be cynical and say, you see, he's purging his enemies. Yes, part of it is there, first on the list. But it goes on the list, which includes many of the own people as well. So, if there has been a corporate mafia, we would like to see it ended quickly. So, the having civil servants that they ought to be non-corrupt, they ought to be competent, they all want to be competent, they all want to be able to do their jobs well. But somehow we have to have changes in the political system that will enable them to really perform their best. In other words, implement NEP that actually works according to its objectives, instead of producing negative side effects and worsening the income distribution. I'm sure that the civil service didn't have that to happen, but So it goes deeper than the civil service. Yeah, perhaps the working block of the civil service could be private for progress. And for Imran, we'll talk about what's the buy-in by the rest of the world. I think buy-in comes when people think it's about. In other words, the organization has to get beyond its initial internal struggle. Like, for example, who becomes the chairman, and if that is a bad situation like Myanmar, where we deny the chairmanship, how shall we deal with it? But it's interesting to note, even though we deny Myanmar the chairmanship because what the rest of us see as unacceptable behavior to small people, Myanmar continues to send representatives to every ASEAN meeting, even though they have just been sentenced already denied the place of the chair. So I think people recognize that they are stronger together. But what is important is that in the internal phase, where internal squabbling is at the most intense, an infant protection policy by a superpower will be very helpful to let survive the birth pains of the organization. So this is where I think Malaysia, within ASEAN, there are two countries that have always been, since 1966, been following much working in concert, Malaysia and Indonesia. And I think it's true. It's just like the French-German axis. So we have that axis in ASEAN. And I see that Macron is the speech that the fact he chose to deliver his leader-hour message in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue, as that the Europeans do see the possibility. But right now, the whole world is going through a very unusual patch. Just like the rise of Europe was delayed by the Luxembourg Compromise, which basically then only in 1986 they changed it. I see that the world may be paralyzed for quite a bit in many ways. If you look at European integration, Marine Le Pen certainly would like to go back to the core idea of the Europe of nations. And you look at the alternative for Germany, and you look at Mr. Farage. But we don't know how strong Farage's support is, because he has this design to run the game for validation of his mandate. So yes, there are big challenges, and I'm not going to say that the job is an easy one, but I think the vision of what is possible is compelling enough that it could lead to actions where our countries have exhausted the internal turmoil by the United States, when it has got tired enough of the antics of Donald Trump. Similarly, some of the European countries might have to go to that as well.
Thank you, Prof. So yes, I think we have a few more questions. I think we should do.
In the past, having the system research and basically in Australia. Well, in fact, the rise of political power has been really touted a lot in recent years, because we sort of like, to face the potential void of the powers that have been, the major powers that have been keeping a lot of the local level, the lower and older in global system, dealing with trade or finance or national global security, etc. But I kind of feel that there's the lack of the discussion or facing the truth. All of these have been providing, that established the global system, have been providing the public goods, global public goods, right? That, luckily or not, has been provided at the expense of major powers, especially like the U.S. and to some extent, the Western powers. But when we talk about these new framework, are we really we should be really ready. I'm not saying are we ready, but to make that framework even to be realistically considered. So we should make sure that we are all ready to take the responsibility and obligations, as well as ensuring the continuity of the global politics. The politics, in many sense, it's going to suffer some of the free riding problems, and I do feel that we should really recognize that we are in this situation because we, as a whole, maybe more really free riding. We have been free riding. There's the international financial system based in the dollar. The U.S. has been providing that dollar-based global liquidity. We've been free riding on the WTO, and actually WTO was on the verge of really non-performing for quite a long time already, because many of the emerging, small economies, actually a lot of legal powers, were taking advantage and not really putting up our resources and making sure that actually is working. It's not just about the talk, right? We really
we get your question. I have to reply to others also.
Sure.
So let me just quickly summarize your question. Your question is that some of the more developed economies have had some cost to pay when it came to global public goods. You have the view that some of the middle powers have been pre-riding some of these institutions. You mentioned the WTO. As the moderator, I probably shouldn't say anything, but as a trade lawyer and a trade negotiator, I'm compelled to disagree with you. But I'll let Professor Wu answer. Now, we'll take one more question.
My name is Martin Sidra. I'm the executive for the Contract Embassy. Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. What you are doing is actually disclosing many things related to what Russia is that's more. But let's sort of without that to look at more anything. My question is connected with your analysis of the possible attitude of global superpowers towards the option of the neutral Atlantic sustainable power. So, the United States have a huge network of nuclear bases either near or even within the territory of these lands to promote that specific sustainable power. What do you think? How the APSP should tackle that question? Because in my point of view, such presence would exert certain pressure, political pressure on countries that should be neutral. So, do you bear in mind any mechanism how the organization should tackle it? To urge it, to make the US give up on them, or maybe it would just be left? Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Bert Tan. I'm a former student of Professor Wu at MSDM cohort. My question is quite hopefully makes some sense. Henry Kissinger also talked about the world going back to the stage of tributes, meaning is that the cultures that we live and things like that people have paying tribute, just like how Malacca used to pay tribute to China many years ago in that construction. The inquiry is that how much do you see of these tribulations that would come out in years to come if we were to move forward? What are your ideas of the G2, what they call coming in place, and what is its role? How will that make these groupings that you have in mind? Because that is something about it whereby culture doesn't culture plays a big role in our societies and things like that.
Sorry, you didn't quite catch your question.
My question comes about is that how much of inherent cultures that we live in terms of behavioral tributes and things like that, whereby we, for example, what we see today is how Trump put in tariffs, and the next thing you know, everybody starts running to him, starting paying videos. Right? How does that?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Let me reverse the order of the questions. But because my students always come first. That's okay. The whole world, up until the middle of the Qing dynasty, there was tribute paid by many peripheral states to China. But it is interesting to note that the Chinese would respond with presents in recognition of your gesture of friendship. The Chinese presents would always be much more valuable in economic terms than what they got. Why? This is a symbol of I'm more powerful than you. So if we are able to keep the peace, you reap a lot of benefits. I give you even more bigger presents than I get from you. To put it in modern terms, the negative picture you have of tributes will come about if you have a G2 outcome. Because the G2 outcome is explicitly designed to squeeze you for presence. And it's a domination sort of structure. But if the individual peripheral states were to be able to coalesce together to form a group, I think that would be a more balanced outcome, not only in terms of agency, but also in terms of shared economic prosperity. Let me give you what I see to be the chief lesson of shared prosperity. On this occasion of the 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations, 1776, we all know we identify Adam Smith with free market capitalism and economic globalization, right? The division of labor. Free trade is good. This is what Adam Smith said in the first half of his book. In the second half, he said Ladies and gentlemen, if we look back of the previous 300 years, which means looking back from 1776, the last 300 years, he said, global integration has been the greatest since historic times, because the world was really integrated only after the landing in Dominican Republic by Christopher Columbus in 1492 and the arrival of Vasco da Gama in Calicut in 1498. That is globalization, right? Free trade. But what happened? It was a time of Adam Smith's examples, a time of unspeakable crimes against humanity. That was free trade. But why should I trade to seek benefits from trade? When I'm more powerful than you, I just grab it from you. The only time free trade is promoted as good is in opium. Otherwise, I just grab it from you. So it was the inequality in military power that makes us unable to benefit from free trade. The wisdom of Adam Smith lies not in pointing out that market voluntary exchange is good, but to point out that the interaction between the oppressed and the oppressor is a process also of technological diffusion. You steal with your eyes. What is it they know? I don't know. The primary example is Japan in 1868, where it overturned its own domestic institutional software to undertake large-scale learning. So, only with equality of power can we truly benefit from trade. That's why there will be buying by middle power countries as they see the organization survive and they draw confidence of it. That's when the tribute system will be of the second type I talk about, which is that you trade with China, there is benefit from that, but the Chinese is will be a technological powerhouse, so is Russia, so is the United States, and their presence in return is technological diffusion of innovations to us. So we may export durian, and they develop the durian drink for us to then standardize and export to the rest of the world. So I see it as a very positive interaction, and that positive interaction is enabled by equal power. Then you have the incentive to actually limit our benefits just gaining by trade rather than pillaging the other side. Now let's come to the second question about the representative from Russia. Yeah, Russia does have every ground to be insecure when there are 800 US military bases around the world. The thing is, as the middle power coalition forms, there will never be a dramatic quick drawdown of the military bases. Because the participants in the coalition are not sure that it will last. So they are not going to say go home, go away. Japan is not going to say close all of it, and not South Korea is not going to say close all of it, except as in election campaign, you can say that, but when you get to power, you know the suicide. There will be a phase down of US military presence. Partly, the US cannot afford it, and partly, the countries themselves do not want that. So in that sense, with an applicable time, the United States always say, the EU, how much do they spend on defense? Until the Ukraine war is 1 to 3%. And they don't come ask for 5. How much does the US spend in defense? at least. The low estimate is 10, the high estimate is like 20. That's it. How much does China spend on defense right now? 8. So they got a free riding. Who could say the Europeans were not really defending themselves? But largely because they saw themselves as safe. There was no, but because of what's happened in Ukraine, they have united Europe in a way that has not been seen. The US has basically shut off a lot of supplies to Ukraine, except for intelligence. Who is supplying the material? The EU. And the defeat of Russia in Ukraine is not necessarily an outcome that people want to see. They want a peaceful resolution. There are 2 of them decide the issue so that there's no clear victor in the side. That's why the Chinese are supporting Mr. Putin. Unlimited friendship, unlimited friendship, or no limits friendship, whatever it is. But part of it is Russia plays a very important role in Chinese national security, facing the US alone, especially on the ground alone, is not a good idea. And Chinese are ready to take a lot of that. Now, is that a friendship that will last forever? The history of both countries show they are frenemies. Very good friends sometimes, not so good sometimes. This is normal in international affairs. The only thing that we can guarantee is, this age of easy divorce, it is repeated at the international level. Let me come down to one very good question that was asked, having to do with Professor Park's statement. The rise of middle powers, free riding, and the ability to integrate quickly and more amicably is more possible now. Why? Because of the benefits. The UN system, the EU, is a basic protocol. And WTO, we don't want the WTO was the first time. So it's the first marriage that is not perfect. So if we get to redo it, we will reform the whole industrial policy component of it. What is the debate on technology about? It is really a debate on the use of industrial policies. Just like we have got protocol banning unfair trading practices, we should have a protocol on the banning of unfair industrial policies. I think once that is settled, it will be cheaper for many countries, because what it means is when you undertake industrial policy, it doesn't work, you get out of it sooner. So one thing is put a time limit on how long you can do industrial policy. Certainly shorter than what Proton Saga and Bavaria had received. Because if something is going to die, it might be easier to take. It's the outside world that's forcing me to let them die. That's the excuse. So I think we do have to tackle it. But what is urgently needed now is we need the public goods of AI regulation. There can be no free riding on that.
All right. Thank you, Professor. That was a much kinder answer to question 1 than I would have responded. Thank you. So we have 10 more minutes. Actually, we have 9 more minutes on the clock. I could take one pressing question. So if anyone has a question that they absolutely need to raise, then perhaps you would like to table that question now or forever hold your peace.
Peace is a good idea.
So Professor Wu says peace is a good idea. Yeah. Alright, so looks like there are no more questions. Maybe we can just quickly bring up the last slide so that if people want to take down a proposed email address, they can. And then if you want to drop an email to him, you may do so. So on that note, please allow me to thank Professor Wu as well as all of you present here today. Professor Wu, thank you so much for your insightful presentation and remarks. I certainly learned a lot today. And to our guests, thank you for all your participation and the questions you have raised. So with that, we have now come to the end of today's roundtable. On behalf of ISIS Malaysia, we wish to express our sincere gratitude to all of you for your presence today as well as your valuable participation. Please join me in giving a huge round of applause to Prof.
The author has placed this work in the public domain. It may be freely imported, exported, shared, distributed, edited, modified, or reformatted without explicit consent from the author. As a visually impaired person, the author asserts his rights under the Marrakesh Treaty to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled. 2013, wipo.int.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to show your support. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to show your support.